Hello everyone, today we read and comment the 7th chapter of the 5th book of Von Clausewitz Vom Kriege. The text follows. We have hitherto been discussing advance guards and outposts in relation to their numerical strength, but there is another difference which we must settle. It is that when an army advances or retires on a certain breadth of ground, it may have a van and rear guard in common for all the columns which are marching side by side, or each column may have one for itself. In order to form a clear idea on this subject, we must look at it in this way. The fundamental conception of an advanced guard, when a corps is so specially designated, is that its mission is the security of the main body or center of the army. If this main body is marching upon several contiguous roads so close together that they can also easily serve for the advanced guard and therefore be covered by it, then the flank columns naturally require no special covering. But those troops which are moving at great distances, in reality as detached corps, must provide their own vanguards. The same applies also to any of those corps which belong to the central mass and owing to the direction that the roads may happen to take are too far from the center column. Therefore, there will be as many advanced guards as there are columns virtually separated from each other. If each of these advanced guards is much weaker than one general one would be, then they fall more into the class of other tactical dispositions, and there is no advanced guard in the strategic tableau. But if the main body or center has a much larger corps for its advanced guard, then that corps will appear as the advanced guard of the wall and will be so in many respects. But what can be the reason for giving the center a vanguard so much stronger than the wings? The following three reasons. 1. Because the mass of troops composing the center is usually much more considerable. 2. Because plainly the central point of a strip of country along which the front of an army is extended must always be the most important point, as all the combinations of the campaign relate mostly to it, and therefore the field of battle is also usually nearer to it than to the wings. 3. Because although a corps thrown forward in front of the center does not directly protect the wings as a real vanguard, it still contributes greatly to their security indirectly. For instance, the enemy cannot in ordinary cases pass by such a corps within a certain distance in order to effect any enterprise of importance against one of the wings, because he has to fear an attack in flank and rear. Even if this check with a corps thrown forward in the center imposes on the enemy is not sufficient to constitute complete security for the wings, it is at all events sufficient to relieve the flanks from all apprehension in great many cases. The vanguard of the center is much stronger than that of a wing, that is to say, if it consists of a special corps as advanced guard, has then not merely the mission of a vanguard intended to protect the troops in its rear from sudden surprise. It also operates in more general strategic relations as an army corps thrown forward in advance. The following are the purposes for which such a corps may be used, and therefore those which determine its duties in practice. 1. To ensure a stouter resistance and make the enemy advance with more caution. Consequently, to do the duties of a vanguard on a greater scale whenever our arrangements are such as to require time before they can be carried into effect. 2. If the central mass of the army is very large, to be able to keep this unwieldy body at some distance from the enemy while we still remain close to him with a more movable body of troops. 3. That we may have a corps of observation close to the enemy if there are any other reasons which require us to keep the principal mass of the army at a considerable distance. The idea that weaker lookout posts, mere partisan corps, might answer just as well for this observation is set aside at once if we reflect how easily a weak corps might be dispersed, and how very limited also are its means of observation as compared with those of a considerable corps. 4. In the pursuit of the enemy, A single corps as advance guard with greater part of the cavalry attached to it can move quicker, arriving later at its bivouac and moving earlier in the morning than the whole mass. 5. Lastly, on a retreat as rear guard to be used in defending the principal natural obstacles of ground. In this respect, also the center is exceedingly important. At first sight, it certainly appears as if such a rear guard would be constantly in danger of having its flanks turned, but we must remember that even if the enemy succeeds in overlapping the flanks to some extent, he has still to march the whole way from there to the center before he can seriously threaten the central mass, which gives time to the rear guard of the center to prolong its resistance and remain in rear somewhat longer. On the other hand, the situation becomes at once critical if the center falls back quicker than the wings. There is immediately an appearance as if the line had been broken through, and even the very idea of or appearance of that is to be dreaded. At no time is there greater necessity for concentration and holding together, and at no time is this more sensibly felt by everyone than on a retreat. The intention always is that the wings, in case of extremity, should close up upon the center, and if on account of subsistence and roads the retreat has to be made on a considerable width of country, still the movement generally ends by a concentration on the center. If we add to these considerations also this one, that the enemy usually advances with his principal force in the center and with the greatest energy against the center, we must perceive that the rear guard of the center is of special importance. Accordingly, therefore, a special corps should always be thrown forward as an advanced guard in every case where one of the above relations occurs. These relations almost fall to the ground if the center is not stronger than the wings, as for example MacDonald when he advanced against Blücher in Silesia in 1813, and the latter when he made his movement towards the Alps. Both of them had 3 corps, which usually moved in 3 columns by different roads, the heads of the columns in line. On this account no mention is made of their having had advanced guards. But this disposition in 3 columns of equal strength is one which is by no means to be recommended, partly on that account, and also because the division of a whole army to 3 parts makes it very unmanageable, and as stated in the 5th chapter of the 3rd book. When the whole is formed into a center with 2 wings separate from it, which we have represented in the preceding chapter as the most natural formation as long as there is no particular object for any other, the corps forming the advance guard according to the simplest notion of the case will have its place in front of the center and therefore before the line which forms the front of the wings. But as the first object of corps thrown out, the flanks is to perform the same office for the sides. As the advance guard for the front, it will very often happen that these corps will be in line with the advance guard, or even still further thrown forward, according to circumstances. With respect to the strengths of an advance guard, we have little to say, as now very properly it is the general custom to detail for that duty one or more component parts of the army of the first class, reinforced by part of the cavalry, so that it consists of a corps if the army is formed in corps, or of a division if the organization is in divisions. It is easy to perceive that in this respect also the great number of higher members or divisions is an advantage. How far the advance guard should be pushed to the front must entirely depend on circumstances. There are cases in which it may be more than a day's march in advance, and others in which it should be immediately before the front of the army. If we find that in most cases between 1 and 3 miles is the distance chosen, that shows certainly that circumstances have usually pointed out this distance as the best, but we cannot make of it a rule by which we are always to be guided. In the foregoing observations we have lost sight altogether of outposts, and therefore we must now return to them again. In saying at the commencement that the relations between outposts and stationary troops is similar to that between advance guards and troops in motion, our object was to refer the conceptions back to their origin and keep them distinct in figure. But it is clear that if we confine ourselves strictly to the words, we should get little more than a pedantic distinction. If an army on the march halts at night to resume the march next morning, the advance guard must naturally do the same, and always organize the outpost duty required both for its own security and that of the main body without, on that account, being changed from an advance guard into a line of outposts. To satisfy the notion of that transformation, the advance guard would have to be completely broken up in a chain of small posts, having either only a very small force or none at all, in a form approaching to a mass. In other words, the idea of a line of outposts must predominate over that of a concentrated corps. The shorter the time of rest of the army, the less complete does the covering of the army require to be, for the enemy has hardly time to learn from day to day what is covered and what is not. The longer the halt is to be, more complete must be the observation and covering of all points of approach. As a rule, therefore, when the halt is long, the vanguard becomes always more and more extended into a line of posts. Whether the change becomes complete or whether the idea of a concentrated corps shall continue uppermost depends chiefly on two circumstances. The first is the proximity of the contending armies. The second is the nature of the country. If the armies are very close in comparison to the width of their front, then it will often be impossible to post a vanguard between them, and the armies are obliged to place their dependence on a chain of outposts. A concentrated corps, as it covers the approaches to the army less directly, generally requires more time and space to act efficiently, and therefore, if the army covers a great extent of front, as in cantonments, and a corps standing in mass is to cover all the avenues of approach, it is necessarily what we should be at a considerable distance from the enemy. On this account, winter quarters, for instance, are generally covered by a cordon of posts. The second circumstance is the nature of the country, where, for example, any formidable obstacle of ground affords the means of forming a strong line of posts with but few troops. We should not neglect to take advantage of it. Lastly, in winter quarters, the rigor of the season may also be a reason for breaking up the advance guard into a line of posts, because it is easier to find shelter for it in that way. The use of a reinforced line of outposts was brought to a great perfection by the Anglo-Dutch army during the campaign of 1794 and 1795 in the Netherlands, when the line of defense was formed by brigades composed of all arms in single posts and supported by a reserve. Scharnhorst, who was with that army, introduced this system into the Prussian army on the Passage in 1807. Elsewhere in modern times, it has been little adopted, chiefly because the wars have been too rich in movement, but even when there has been occasion for its use, it has been neglected, as for instance by Murat at Tarutino. A wider extension of his defensive line would have spared him the loss of 30 pieces of artillery in a combat of outposts. It cannot be disputed that in certain circumstances great advantages may be derived from this system. We propose to return to the subject on another occasion. So today we complete the second part of the chapter, which is dedicated, as you have understood, to the disposition of the vanguard, its size. The advantages broadly meant that in function of combat specifically, so mostly from a tactical reason, are to be taken into consideration. There is a conclusion about fundamentally about outposts, as we've seen as well. Relatively to the first point, we've seen that the key of interpretation in here is that a strong vanguard is very important, essentially to let's say dispense in part from strong flank units on the center, right? Because that presence alone has some effect on the main battle line in the center. That now we will see. So von Clausewitz says we have either been discussing advanced guards and outposts in relation to their numerical strength, but there is another difference which we must settle. It is that when an army advances or retires on a certain breadth of ground, it may have a van or rear guard in common for all the columns which are marching side by side, or each column may have one for itself. So the concept is very clear. There are situations in which an army marches with the various units in separated columns that along a vector, right? Of course they can take different paths, and now we'll see also what happens when they distance themselves excessively, in fact. But generally speaking, if the distance between the various columns is the breadth that this columns occupy laterally, let's say, during the advance is small enough, a strong vanguard can fundamentally work for them all without each column having a vanguard on its own. So the concept is very, very simple. Then von Clausewitz writes, in order to form a clear idea on this subject, we must look at it in this way. The fundamental conception of an advanced guard, when a corps is so especially designated, is that its mission is the security of the main body of the center of the army. This is an important concept. Objectively, the vanguard has essentially this role, right? It's like the spearhead of a formation. You don't have much of an interest to cover the flanks, let's say, with a vanguard. It's smaller. It's smaller compared to the width that the center of the formation, that is the bulkier part of the army on average, because the thing can change, to care fundamentally about the covering more front. It's literally a spearhead. It's literally something that, exactly because its capacity to pierce is devoted, if you want. It's less careful, right? It doesn't need it to be less careful to have a flank on the sides. Some wings on the side. That's the term I wanted to come to. This is interesting now. It even made me realize an interesting interpretation in medieval armies and so on. Usually, it happens actually. Every single body has its, of course, wings in a way or another. But as we have seen, the function of the vanguard is also to be, in terms of specific weight, more piercing than the main body, right? That instead mostly acts out of its mass, right? But it's also its primary function is exactly this: is fundamentally to ideally push through the enemy, or at least to resist and to wear him out before you engage with the main body, right? So this linear axis in depth of the formation is fundamentally what this position is combined for. It's based on the gradual effort, right? It's a system of reserves, in a nutshell. So then von Clausewitz says, main body if this main body is marching upon several contiguous roads so close together that it can also easily serve for the advance guard and therefore be covered by it, then flank columns naturally require no special covering. So von Clausewitz goes as far as saying that, if the vanguard has this dramatic force, not only the various columns that benefit altogether from it do not need flank units interspersed between the various columns, but also properly the outer ones on the flanks do not need such a special covering after all. And this is clear, right? It's very geometrical as a concept, but it obviously depends on the circumstances. But in terms of a formation mostly in column, for example, as far as concerned, so that it has a much deeper deployment than it is broad, right? This is pretty important, and the vanguard exactly in that moment is actually more functional because it's still in a moment in which the army is fundamentally on the move, so it's going out there for combat, but still it's not gotten there yet. And the vanguard, as we've seen in previous parts, has this function naturally of buying time for the main body to deploy for combat. And at that point, yeah, you can have the system of reserves, but also the concept of the vanguard will have less of a, let's say, function, right? So this is also connected naturally to the broader strategic function of the vanguard. That is, to delay, if you want, the with a tactical engagement on its own, the tactical engagement of the main body. Right. Then von Clausewitz says, but those corps which are moving at great distances, in reality, as detached corps, must provide their own vanguards, and this is also obvious because it's as if you had separated armies in a way. So each and everyone can, if they're too distant, they're too detached, cannot cover each other's flanks. So they need essentially a vanguard on their own. The same applies also, von Clausewitz writes, to any of those corps which belong to the central mass, and owing to the direction that the roads may happen to take are too far from the center column. That is, the column can't get too overstretched. So there is always, as we've seen before, to consider an independency in the various bodies that constitute the army that, as we have seen in Napoleonic times, as Clausewitz is mostly describing as an example, just as a model at this point, are the norm. That is, all independent units, fundamentally at brigade level, that have every thing they need to be autonomous, tactically speaking. They fundamentally enjoy both of the three arms in the correct, in the functional, in the best integration, let's say. It can act fully independently in a way, as monads, as different modules on their own. Therefore, von Clausewitz writes, there will be as many advanced guards as there are columns virtually separated from each other. Right? This is clear. If each of these advanced guards is much weaker than one general one would be, right, then they fall more into the class of other tactical dispositions, right? And there is no advanced guard in the strategic tableau. That is to say, naturally, the smaller the vanguard is, and the more its function tends, it's important, let's say, tends towards the tactical dimension, and the least towards the strategical one. Obviously, they always have, where and another. But this concept is obvious, also considering that the vanguard, yes, we can overpower it. Usually, we have seen this, especially when you're pursuing an enemy, you need to, for it to be dynamic, flexible, but also, heavy in the measure it can punch, right? So, all of this is relative. It all depends on the situation, but the concept here is also that hopefully this vanguard, if it has to give enough, to buy enough time for the deployment of the main body, well, it also has to have a consistency on its own, so that it doesn't melt away just as the enemy approaches, right? So there is always this inherent tension between the two. Either every time you take something away from one party, it adds to another, and and you don't create further matter, right, out there. So it's always a compromise, and this is what you have to understand when you study the Vom Kriege, that this is not an absolute disposition. It just reveals a set of mechanics that usually take place, right, and beyond a single specific time in history, but that naturally can vary by degrees, and especially when you are in command, you are effectively in charge of making them vary according to these degrees, right? And it's to that flexibility that you have to get used in a way. So the third column, and there's an advancing tableau. But, Clausewitz writes, if the main body or center has a much larger corps for its advanced guard, then that corps will appear as the advanced guard of the wall, and will be so in many respects. It is naturally, the larger the vanguard is, and the more it can cover the front, and the broader security of the entire army, which is also obvious, but also becomes more mass attached for the main body, and that may not be necessarily, because that's easier in theory for the enemy to defeat in detail, right? Then von Clausewitz questions, but what can be the reasons for giving the center a vanguard so much stronger than the wings, right? And here it comes back on the concept of, the function that a vanguard in its central disposition compared to the axis of the army in depth, has on the wings, on the flanks, right, on the capacity of let's say of the army to defend its wings, but also for the enemy to have problems to in fact outflank the enemy. Von Clausewitz says the following 3 reasons. So the first one is because the mass of troops composing the center is usually much more considerable, right? And this is a very important intuition because it's self-evident, but it is always to be taken into consideration. I mean, even if you attack a body that doesn't have the support of wings, which usually it is the case, von Clausewitz has outlined this, ideal model that you could use, at least in his own times. But that has a more universal value. Normally, the center is a good center if it has wings. But the concept is that still the center in itself constitutes, has wings, right? Usually it's a formation that deploys mostly in breadth than in depth. And even if it wasn't, it always has a breadth in a way. There could be further considerations for considering angles of fire and so on. But we know, let's take the example of how Napoleonic era was fought like. The concept here, though, is that, let's imagine you have, let's say, the same amount of troops that you can divide in, you can deploy either in a single big center or in a center minus the wings that you leave out on the flanks. The question there is that you're talking fundamentally about, you can see it at least as a same bulk, right? The functionality of the wings is to add more flexibility, which means also to, in a way, also in here, to take away something from the mass of the center, right? For the sake of the flank security. But the center in itself has, however, still this inherent capacity to resist even to a flank attack, right? The larger the unit is, independently from the existence of wings or not. This depends on a lot of factors, but tendentially it is true. The second reason is because plainly the central point of a strip of country along which the front of an army is extended must always be the most important point, as all the combinations of the campaign relate mostly to it, and therefore the field of battle is also usually nearer to it than to the wings, right? This is also important, and that's a bit the same concept. That is, the wings, especially consider this time's linear tactics, how they were developing, and so on. This was already something way more dynamic and more advanced. Napoleonic eras had scorporated, if you want, the linear tactic properly meant. But there still is, of course, a more complex, an even larger, but still linear disposition. That is to say, these armies are deployed much more in breadth than in depth. As a consequence, what von Clausewitz means here is that what matters in these battles is not much whether you have wings or not, but the more the battle line, independently of how you have detached it, is extended properly in breadth, for the breadth of the formation. That is to say that proportionally the wings have less importance, haven't they? They're always there with the same function, but it's more how much you hold across the wall line that necessarily managing to break through in the way that there is to break through by making the wings collapse or just one. There is a symmetry, as we've seen, that is increasing in European armies at this point. So it becomes always more difficult to say, okay, I have a wing that is stronger than another, so I can't make this outflanking maneuver. The Napoleonic battles are, the distancing, if you want, ever more from the strictly tactical point of the interaction of these units, but rather to approaching the strategical broader dimension of how much mass do you oppose all together, independently from these divisions. They still are important, fundamental, nobody denies that, but proportionally have less importance than in previous times, right? Outflanking an enemy in a wing, think about Pharsalus, was maybe what all the battle was about. And here it's very different. Also, there are lots of reserves, as we've seen. So even if you break the wing, not necessarily you'll make it through eventually. And it's all more complex and difficult. And there are longer spaces, so there is more time to buy and to cope with the flank. So the symmetry that has been reached in here is such for which also this big deal of division between center and wings is not of excessive importance. Well, it's really important in this depth, let's say in reserve, in this capacity of making last more time. What's the vanguard doing, right? The third reason is because although a corpse thrown forward in front of the center does not directly protect the wings as a real vanguard, right? It still contributes greatly to their security indirectly. For instance, the enemy cannot in ordinary cases pass by such a corpse within a certain distance in order to effect any enterprise of importance against one of the wings, because he has to fear an attack in flank and rear. This one is possibly the most important point as far as, especially the enemy is concerned in a way, as you understand. And I could actually conclude the point because it says, even if this check with a corpse thrown forward in center imposes on the enemy, it is not sufficient to constitute complete security for the wings. It is at all events sufficient to relieve the flanks from all apprehension in a great many cases. So this third point is really important because it shows you how even if you have this kind of crazy vanguard in the way, right, as you are from the other side, so the enemy vanguard is out there. The point is that if you want to outflank the enemy, things become much more complicated. First of all, we have stressed here the symmetry of these deployments normally. So first of all, in that case, you would have to cope with an enemy flank plus this vanguard in the front that fundamentally exposes your inner side, your flank, the flank of your wing while you're fighting against the corresponding enemy wing in the front. So that actually decreases a big deal the effectiveness of that wing of yours. Naturally, if you have a vanguard, to cope symmetrically with the enemy vanguard, it's literally the same. But in that case, you fundamentally dilation time. You still say, okay, you also have to detach this body. We have also to spend these resources. The point is, if you don't do that, you're also kind of blocked, and you give more time to the enemy, for example, to deploy, maybe on a better ground, to improve to spot your weak points and so on. So it is really a problem. It's really something that makes a difference on the field. And as a consequence, you'll probably be using the same symmetrically. And when that happens, it's like the odds are ever more balanced, right? So it becomes an ever more difficult and attritional clash. This can vary a lot. You're not even necessarily in the condition of carrying it out. Maybe not even the enemy. Depends on the ground. It depends on a lot of things, right? Let's be honest. As always, as we were saying, these are relative terms. But the objective problem posed by this move is something you have to cope with, and there's no way around it. Literally, because even if you get around the vanguard, still there is this problem that you always have this thorn in the side for which you can even maybe, let's suppose you even manage in a way to make an enemy flank collapse, but you still have, you're operating on the enemy flank with this vanguard that is that divides you ever separate, endangers you, let's say better, ever more from your main body, and therefore you also are lacking more confidence in a way. Your morale is not so high. As if the vanguard was not there, and you had just broken one enemy wing and trying to outflank, right? That in fact influences especially the moral effectiveness, I would say, of your own vanguard. And then von Clausewitz says the vanguard of the center, if much stronger than that of a wing, that is to say, if it consists of a special corps as advance guard, has then not merely the mission of a vanguard intended to protect the troops in its rear from a sudden surprise. It also operates in more general strategic relations as an army corps thrown forward in advance. That is to say, this thing, as we've seen, especially, I don't remember which was either 2 or 3 chapters before, when von Clausewitz, no, it was actually even before, when von Clausewitz talks about the end of the first of the previous chapter, when he talks about the pursuit, and that we've seen, as we were saying before, also how this vanguard sometimes is like not just even a small army on its own, but even something that in relative terms has a higher specific weight, because it's more active, it's more punchy, it's more dynamic, it's kind of more elite, to make the long story short. So that unit will not have just the task of buying time. It will have a greater importance. That also, as we've seen, it depends. If you start retreating, that will become, for example, your rear guard, right? So it has many functions, and it's fundamentally a unit in which you invested a lot, taking away a lot from your own mass, and that you have that you have deliberately exposed actually to more attrition in a way or not, right? It all depends on what's the condition of the enemy, but things change constantly. So von Clausewitz says the following are the purposes for which such a corps may be used, and therefore those which determine its duties in practice. So these are 5 reasons. So the first one is to ensure a stouter resistance and make the enemy advance with more caution, right? This is evident, which means, yes, still buying time, of course, which is always there, but also, making him lose also men, resource, and energies, confidence, whatever. Consequently, to do the duties of a vanguard on a greater scale, von Clausewitz says, whenever our arrangements are such as to require time before they can be carried into effect, which we have just said. So, 2. If the central mass of the army is very large, to be able to keep this unwieldy body at some distance from the enemy while we still remain close to him with a more movable body of troops. That is to say, literally, you may have, independently from the let's say the time you want to buy, but difficulties in deployability of the main body for whichever reason at the moment. So you just want to say like that, right? Also to buy time in a way, but still, maybe, I don't know, you would prefer the main body to remain in defense, right? So you just wait for the enemy to wear it's himself out against this powerful vanguard that can also be more dynamic, right? That can be a tactic or a strategy to also depend, because this can happen on different scale, right? 3. That we may have a corps of observation close to the enemy if there are any other reasons which require us to keep the principal mass of the army at a considerable distance. That is to say, you're essentially spying on the enemy, and you need him to stay there, to stay more distance from your own army, and you want to support this fundamentally with your this powerful corps in an advanced position. This can be all kind of intertwined, right, as a reason. Von Clausewitz adds to the third point that, quote, the idea that weaker look outposts, mere partisan corps, might answer just as well for this observation is set aside at once if we reflect how easily a weak corps might be dispersed, right? And how very limited also are its means of observation as compared with those of considerable corps. So it's a bit what we were saying before, relatively to the, how, easy it is to make this vanguard melt away compared to the mass. Here, it is compared the vanguard that is supporting this outpost. The outposts are just like, the eyes of the army in a way, but they are small units normally. So you need to support these, to spy on them, on the enemy, with this greater force that in practice can also overlap to the outposts. So that actually a greater force, just because of all the detachments it can send, and the greater time simply that it remains exposed to the enemy, actually can buy more information, can get more information from this this thing. So that is also an important reason why you want to do it. 4. In the pursuit of the enemy, a single corps as advance guard with the greater part of the cavalry attached to it can move quicker, arriving later at its bivouac and moving earlier in the morning than the whole mass. Right? So this is what we also described extensively at the end of the last chapter, exactly introducing the need of this vanguard. So here it's the enemy is on the run essentially, and you're on his heels, and you overload this vanguard with cavalry so that you can harass him. You don't give him time to rest, and so on. And cavalry can also carry out most of these attacks by essentially having more speedily from a tactical point of view, so that compared to infantry, can operate on a longer time, because instead than an hour of coming back to the bivouac, it takes half an hour, and so that's much easier in a way. So you can you can really inflict considerable masses to the enemy, and to be simply more this vanguard at this point is like an extension of the army, right? For reasons of security, but also because, as we have seen, the wall mass cannot go as fast, right? And as the cavalry, this vanguard broadly meant, which also considered it's usually, if this is after a big battle, it becomes you're also exhausted, right? Not just the enemy. So you have to rely mostly on these units that are most of the cavalry that is specialized in this specific function, that it's way more economical at that point for that specific role, for carrying out that specific task. 5, von Clausewitz says, lastly, on your retreat as a rear guard, to be used in defending the principal natural obstacles of the ground, which is also evident, right? You want simply this corps to cover your back while you retreat, and exploiting all the, doing all possible to naturally to buy you time to distance yourself from the enemy, and exploiting the principal natural obstacles of ground that must be held anyway. Which naturally have this intrinsic defensive function that can increase the force, the effectiveness of this corps in defense, and inflict more losses to the enemy in the process. Von Clausewitz writes, in this respect, also the center is exceedingly important. At first sight, it certainly appears as if such a rearguard would be constantly in danger of having its flanks turned, right? But we must remember that if the enemy succeeds in overlapping the flanks to some extent, he has still to march the whole way from there to center before he can seriously threaten the central mass, which gives time to the rearguard of center to prolong its resistance and remain in rear somewhat longer. This is a beautiful explanation that also for what's stated above relatively to the capacity of a vanguard, just also an offensive function to cover the flanks of the larger of the main body, right? And here even more, because von Clausewitz is saying fundamentally this vanguard that has transformed itself into a rearguard now because you're retreating is usually smaller than the main body, so it's somewhat more exposed naturally to the on its own flanks, right? Because the enemy usually is larger and so on. So naturally, a moment in which you retreat, this is not a kind of a very pleasant condition. So it's tough to have such a rearguard that is able to resist, but to the enemy is that much. The point is, if the enemy is pursuing you, right? So what counts here is literally the linear distance that separates it from you. And von Clausewitz says, if the enemy is trying to outflank this vanguard, what it is factually happening is that still the distance between you and him, or better, the time between you and him is that will take him to reach you is lengthening, right? Because in the moment in which you are not pursuing, he's not pursuing you or pushing through the vanguard anymore, but trying to outflank it, he is not following the vector that will reach you in a straight line, right? So it's as if he was taking other paths, because he's literally doing that, right, in order to outflank. So that's where, paradoxically, you are being covered in a sense, right? So, and it's as if that was a guard that veiled, not just frontally, but a bit on the whole arm, right? Then von Clausewitz says, on the other hand, the situation becomes at once critical if the center falls back quicker than the wings. That's really something you don't want to happen. Why? Because there is immediately an appearance as if the line had been broken through, and even the very idea of appearance of that is to be dreaded, right? You need those freaking wings, or you need covered flanks. You need at least a stronger mass in that situation, and not for the enemy to make it more difficult to outflank it with a considerable amount of troops. What we didn't say before is that, of course, in order to outflank the enemy, you have to take something away from the mass of your center. So, in a way, to thin, in other words, to thin the battle line altogether, so that you maybe get outflanked, but you can counter-strike maybe in the center. This is also a directly proportional function, as you understand. So everything has a cost. Every action, right, has a cost. But there is also an intrinsic superiority of the outflanking compared to the frontal attack, or even naturally an attack from the rear. But here it's supposed that even if you're retreating, and the enemy engages you, you're not keeping to retreat. I mean, you're standing your ground at that point, so you have turned, and there's not the rear anymore, the front, but still the flanks are not. So those are freaking vulnerable, and you never have to make the wings detach from the center. In fact, von Clausewitz says, at no time is there a greater necessity for concentration and holding together, and at no time is this more sensibly felt by everyone than on a retreat. The intention always is that the wings, in case of extremity, should close upon the center, and if on account of subsistence and roads, the retreat has to be made on a considerable width of country, still the movement generally ends by a concentration on the center. If we add to these considerations also this one, that the enemy usually advances with his principal force in the center with the greatest energy against the center, we must perceive that the rear guard of the center is of special importance. Right? This is really meaningful, because von Clausewitz is saying, as far as I understand, that and we have seen this during the retreat. Naturally, first of all, the obvious. That is easily understandable, that when you retreat, that's usually not a good situation, right? So you're losing something in the meanwhile, right? You may do it for a good strategic reason to keep battle somewhere else, but it's still not a good situation. What von Clausewitz says is that during this retreat, you're losing something, and there is a need for essentially not outstretching the battle line. Because that fundamentally creates this thin line that can be more easily pierced, and during the retreat also you want mostly to have the control on the units, so the reasonable thing to do is to concentrate also your wings towards the center to close up. As a consequence, the enemy should, throughout all this, trying to outflank you, to send detachments, as we've seen during the pursuit, to seize strategic points that you can't do, so that, especially with cavalry, so that you can't exploit them from the retreat. He has not to give you a minute of rest. So in the worst of cases, what this will get down to is that you're going to be reached, and you're going to have to stand your ground. And in this, it is crucial to stand your ground in a single point, right? In this moment in which you have to all together, and therefore the breadth of the line is not as important as how much you concentrate in the center. As you mostly make this mass, this punching thing, that, as we have seen also in the worst of situation, if you really think you're gonna lose, it's preferable literally to launch yourself to break against the enemy, which is maybe unexpected, especially in these situations where you're retreating, your morale is lower, right? So this rear guard of yours will have a dramatically important role in ensuring that you can carry out that maneuver effectively. Right? So this is really of special importance for making this essentially this last stand in the center, possibly even a desperate counterattack against the enemy that has reached you. Then von Clausewitz, make an example, says, accordingly, therefore, a special corps should always be thrown forward as an advance guard in every case where one of the above relations occurs. So practically most of the cases. And von Clausewitz says these relations almost fall to the ground if the center is not stronger than wings, as for example MacDonald when he advanced against Blücher in Silesia in 1813, and the latter when he made his movement towards the Elbe. Right? This is so. Clausewitz is saying, if your center has been worn out, if I understand correctly, and the wings are stronger, then at that point the ground naturally increases in importance, because it's mostly what is going to make the difference. In at least the more it's going to make the difference, the more hopefully if you find the right ground, right, to make this last stand. And von Clausewitz says both of them, both MacDonald and Blücher, had 3 corps, which usually moved in 3 columns by different rows, the heads of the columns in line. Right. On this account, no mention is made of their having advance guards. But this disposition in 3 columns of equal strength is one of which by no means to be recommended, partly on that account, and also because the division of a whole army into 3 parts makes it very unmanageable, as stated in the 5th chapter of the 3rd book. So this disposition was perhaps the worst, in the sense that they took away a lot of flexibility. They had no vanguard. They were just relying on the center wings, no reserves, and this unwieldy reality that didn't benefit them for sure. But then von Clausewitz writes, when the wall is formed into a center with 2 wings separate from it, which we have presented in preceding chapter as the most natural formation as long as there is no particular object for any other, the corps forming the advance guard, according to the simplest notion of the case, will have its place in front of the center, and therefore before the line which forms the front of the wings. But as the first object of corps thrown out on the flanks is to perform the same office for side as the advance guard for the front, it will very often happen that these corps will be in line with the advance guard, or even still further thrown forward, according to the circumstances. So, you understand, here there is nothing to explain actually, if not the fact that the vanguard fundamentally maintains always its own function, but if you really have to use this troops on the wings, either it's gonna be, in front of the wings proper, either they're gonna line up with the rest of the vanguard, and at that point, as we've seen, it's fundamentally better just for it to be more punching like in the front. Either they're gonna be surpassing it in the front, and therefore they're gonna have, they're gonna be even more exposed in a sense, and detached from the body. So it's not good situation after all. And in fact, von Clausewitz says, with respect to the strength of an advance guard, we have little to say, as now very properly it is the general custom to detail for that duty 1 or more component parts of the army of the first class, reinforced by the part of the cavalry, so that it consists of a corps if the army is formed in corps, or of a division if the organization is in divisions. It is easy to perceive that in this respect also a great number of higher members of divisions is an advantage. How far the advance guard should be pushed to the front must entirely depend on circumstances. There are cases in which it may be more than a day's march in advance, which is a lot, and others in which it should be immediately before the front of the arm. If we find that in most cases between 1 or 3 miles is the distance chosen, right, that shows certainly that circumstances have usually pointed out this distance as the best, but we cannot make of it a rule by which we are to be always guided. That is to say, here you understand what the deal is. We have said it before. The longer, the more distant the vanguard is compared to the front, to the mass, to the center, the more the risk that is gonna be overwhelmed and that it will not be able to even, of course, act as we've seen in previous chapters, like supported by the greater body of the arm. But if it is too close, it also will see less. So von Clausewitz says, usually, at least the way we do war now, it's like from 1 to 3 miles in distance, which is a good distance after all, right? It is to be covered in just a few time, right? In 1 hour more of march, but it's enough to shield you from the enemy in a way. And naturally, this also reveals still a kind of fairly close tactical dimension here. That is, these are distances that are properly conceived to have a tactical support, not just for buying time in strategical terms, right? This is how they operated at the time. Then von Clausewitz speaks of outposts. Finally says, in the foregoing observations, we have lost sight altogether of outposts, and therefore we must now return to them again. In saying at the commencement that the relations between outposts and stationary troops is similar to that between advance guard and troops in motion, our object was to refer to the conceptions back to their origin and keep them distinct in future. But it is clear that if we confine ourselves strictly to the words, we should get little more than a pedantic distinction. If an army on the march halts at night to resume the march next morning, the advance guard must naturally do the same, and always organize the outpost duty required both for its own security and that of the main body without, on that account, being changed from an advance guard into a line of outposts. To satisfy the notion of that transformation, the advance guard would have to be completely broken up into a chain of small posts, having either only a very small force or none at all, in a form of approaching to a mass. In other words, the idea of a line of outposts must predominate over that of a concentrated corps. The shorter the time of rest of the army, the less does the covering of the army require to be, for the enemy has hardly time to learn from day to day what is covered and what is not. The longer the halt is to be, the more complete must the observation and covering of all points of approach. As a rule, therefore, when the halt is long, the vanguard becomes always more and more extended into a line of posts. Whether the change becomes complete or whether the idea of a concentrated corps shall continue uppermost depends chiefly on two circumstances. The first is the proximity to the contending armies. The second is the nature of the country. Right. So you have your situations in this, which we could say that the least the more there is a suspension of the military action in a sense, the more this vanguard is going to spread. Right. Even suspension of military action, as we've seen, is broadly meant in this, let's say, relative terms, saying, when you're fighting, when you're not. So, obviously, if you spend more time encamped somewhere, and it means that the enemy is not showing up, right? So, as a consequence, you're going to be more secure, generally speaking, and you're going to extend. This also, for the encampment, for the also because the local resources are going to come less, or at least you have to be careful about staying for too long in a single place, unless you really don't have all what you need. But also, the generally you will tend to spread out, right? And that will also give you, if you want an edge, as far as the vanguard is concerned, to detach all these various outposts that will give you a greater range of security, so that you don't have to count on just on enemy territory, and you don't know what is out there in 1 or 3 miles, as we have seen before. But on the contrary, you will have, a much longer view. So given that with messengers you can easily go faster than an army, you have all the time to get ready at the moment for battle, and just during the march into a hostile territory that you do not know. This is the concept. So Clausewitz says, if the armies are very close in comparison to the width of their front, then it will often be impossible to post a vanguard between them, and the armies are obliged to place their dependence on a chain of outposts. So this is also intuitive. I mean, if the armies are too close, in the sense that at least as far as the battle line, the breadth of that they're going to occupy is mainly in that function of combat is extended, well, the more the less a vanguard is needed, because first of all, you're in the face of the enemy, and you're already deployed fundamentally for attack, so you don't need to. I mean, what's that vanguard there for, right? It's mostly not pretty practical or functional, given you have already arranged the battle line for combat, and so you can actually use it to reinforce your own line at that point. So there's literally sometimes no space to make it practical. You're just gonna make a mess. And by having these things in the middle, while the breadth of the army is gonna simply make this battleground unfold in a few times, and you're going to find yourself in the middle with this troops. So what's the deal, right? It's not particularly convenient. But outposts instead, with sentries and so on, are going to be there. Also, their importance naturally is less, because it's not they're going to work as a vanguard anymore. They're just any better than seeing from a smaller perspective essentially just what the enemy's up to, but the broader picture, as we've seen, is already decided. So it's going to be less relevant. So Von Clausewitz then says, a concentrated corps, as it covers the approaches to the army less directly, generally requires no time and space to act efficiently, and therefore, if the army covers great extent of front, as in cantonments, and a corps standing in mass is to cover all the avenues of approach, it is necessary that we should be at a considerable distance from the enemy. On this account, winter quarters, for example, are generally covered by a cordon of posts. The second circumstance is the nature of the country, where, for example, any formidable obstacle of ground affords the means of forming a strong line of posts but few troops. We should not neglect to take advantage of it. Right? So what von Clausewitz is saying here is that this corps in the middle, and that may be needed in certain situations, is in fact useful in these two situations. In winter, when you need fundamentally more ground to be detached in, because you have less resources, you have more difficulty to get supplies and so on, so you're going to sustain yourself on a broader area. Well, that can be useful, because if the enemy is going to attack, it's more difficult for you to get ready, right? So that increases the possibility of having troops deploy in the front. The other is the ground. I mean, you have a very strong, you're over a ridge, and that is for some reason where the enemy has deployed in front. You deploy in there, and it's better to have it presided. But as von Clausewitz will say now, that role will actually be important also for the mass, right? You may actually want to station all your army there, unless naturally it depends on the ground even in here, right? Not necessarily a ridge is good for encampment or staying in front of the enemy. Maybe you just need that as a front line than a camp in reserve, right? And von Clausewitz says the use of a reinforced line of outposts was brought to great perfection by the Anglo-Dutch army during the campaign of 1794 and 1795 in the Netherlands, and when the line of defense was formed by brigades composed of all arms in single posts and supported by a reserve. So you understand the picture here. The armies themselves were basically, of the corps were deployed in line as if they were outposts, and there was this reserve just in case, but they made up the line altogether. And von Clausewitz says Scharnhorst was with that army introduced by this system into the Prussian army on the Passage in 1807. Elsewhere, in modern times, it has been little adopted, chiefly because the wars have been too rich in movement. So this was fine just essentially for holding that line. You've seen in the previous cases how useful it can be. But even when there has been occasion for its use, it has been neglected, as for instance by Murat at Tarutino. A wider extension of his defensive line would have spared him the loss of 30 pieces of artillery in combative outposts. Right. This is important because it really speaks for that capacity of outflanking and in those conditions in which you can, and instead a block in front prevents you from doing. And in that case, that unit had its own concentrated impact on the enemy that wasn't properly exploited, properly avoided by the enemy. Then von Clausewitz says, it cannot be disputed that in certain circumstances great advantages may derive from this system. We propose to return to the subject on another occasion. Right? So, alright, we will see that at that point. This was it. So you understand how many different situations actually can unfold. Right here we see from a general disposition of armies during Napoleonic years, as we've seen in this more flexible way, but there are some, in case of defensive position needed, they're rare because armies were larger, there was a greater tactical and strategical dynamism. That von Clausewitz says, in some cases, this fact of using the single armies of the corps as into a line in defensive function is, after all, not bad. Right, given there is a reserve and you can help them resist to the enemy. And so, yeah, I mean, this is also a more positional warfare that, as you know, in fact, would be kind of snubbed but throughout old 19th century military culture because people were obsessed with maneuver for Napoleonic times. But von Clausewitz, that not surprisingly, also took a step forward in the formulation of a new theory of the art of war, and doctrine says, it's not always like that, right? Scharnhorst, for example, that you can't speak of von Clausewitz without Scharnhorst, well, had adopted that model, had seen its effectiveness, and even repeated it in the Prussian army. So it's that speaks of the flexibility properly needed in order to do something with your armed forces, right? And so that it's particularly instructive, we could say. However, for now we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.